Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest. January 2nd, 2025. The Thank You, Jimmy Carter edition. I'm David Plotz of CityCast, celebrating the new year here in my Washington, D.C. home. From New York Times Magazine and Yale University Law School, the 2025 version of Emily Bazelon, a year older, but even wiser, even more than a year wiser.
What else am I more of? I don't want to think about that. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Emily. And John Dickerson of CBS News. Hello, John Dickerson. Happy New Year. Also older and wiser.
Happy New Year, David. And Happy New Year to you, Emily. And I'm already collecting conundrums for our 2025 show.
This week on the Gabfest, we will remember Jimmy Carter and talk about his impact on America and the world, both as president and afterwards. Then the conflict between the two wings of the new Republican Party, a Musk wing and a MAGA nationalist wing over immigration, what it could signal about Trump's presidency. Then there's a fascinating story in the New Yorker that explores citizen assemblies in which average local Joes and Janes get together, talk to each other, and make policy recommendations to the government. We'll talk to the author, Nick Romeo. Plus, we'll have cocktail chatter, and we're going to try something new in the coming weeks and months. We want to do Slate Plus episodes that are based on your questions. If you have a question for us, something you'd like us to discuss that we can devote a Slate Plus episode to, please email them to us at gabfest@slate.com. It could be public policy related. It could be about something in the news. It could be about something completely off base that you are interested in our thoughts on, or maybe not even interested in our thoughts, interested in mocking our thoughts about. But just email them to us at gabfest@slate.com.
If you're not interested in our thoughts, we will pose the question and then we will just sit mute for 15 minutes.
It could be John Cage, 4 minutes and 13 seconds. We could do our own version of that. I wonder what's the longest silence that's ever been on the show. Can't have been more than like 6 seconds.
Many of your listeners are thinking, whatever it wasn't long enough.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today? Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. And that's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you can save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states and situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
The political Gabfest, I would say, began for me in 1979, late 1979, when I was a fourth grader in Lafayette Elementary School, and the Iran hostage crisis began. And my introduction to the idea of the president and the presidency was during that crisis, and the sense of helplessness and despair that seemed to envelop the country and seemed to take the president with it. Jimmy Carter, for me, as president, was never like that toothy, smiling antidote to the sourness of Richard Nixon and Watergate and Vietnam. That's what he was when he ran. But by the time I started paying attention to him, he was kind of a forlorn, worn down figure as president. And yet that was true for me. I think it was true for a lot of Americans by the time he left office and was replaced by the Western sunshine of Ronald Reagan. But by the time he died this past week, he died as a true American hero, the model of the moral and humble servant leader. It was a remarkable life, a remarkable presidential life, and an even more remarkable post-presidential life, as so many people have already noted. So, John, I want to start with you. What is your most vivid memory of Jimmy Carter, either as president or post-president?
What a great question. And you've made me realize something, which is that my first presidential memory is watching the Carter inauguration, not the walking down Pennsylvania Avenue, which he did, which was a early symbolic act in his effort to make the presidency more approachable, not the imperial presidency of Nixon, but a presidency in which this was a common man coming into the job, and we should talk about his campaign and all of that. But the actual inauguration, because my mother was in the business and had gotten a machine that was capable of recording what took place on the television so that you could watch it later. It was a Betamax machine, and we taped the inauguration. Anyway, it's also the presidency that was my first presidency. The two memories I have are, well, I guess the one is that the Carter to me has always been a fascinating presidency because it about so many things he was so right in terms of the office and in terms of trying to be innovative and change it, and yet about so many things he was also just totally wrong. So as a presidential president, there's always been so much that's been fascinating to me about his time in the job. But as a person, if you read or listen to Jonathan Alter's book about Jimmy Carter's life, the internal sense of honor and character and duty and commitment to both his fellow man and his God is just this solid line through his whole life. And I obviously didn't know him in office, but after he was out of office, I did a story on him at Habitat for Humanity and interviewed him there. And his commitment to other people, which I think hurt him in office in some ways, which we can discuss, but obviously that ran throughout his life, is just a model of public behavior. And to the extent that we can do things by our words and by our acts, his acts were completely consistent with his values and our model for how to live, particularly if you're a Christian, in a way that is what we're called to do.
So, John, can we go back to what he got right and what he got wrong? Like, how do you think about those two themes of his presidency?
It's a huge question, but let's see if I can do it quickly. Structurally, what he got right is that the presidency is a team job. It's not one single person. And so he bought into this idea that Stephen Hess at the Brookings Institution had put forward, which was you needed a cabinet-centered government. So don't run everything out of the White House. Give power to your cabinet secretaries and let them do things. That was a crashing disaster because basically cabinet secretaries try and do stuff and then the White House gets blamed. So there is a famous...
And he had no chief of staff for years, right? That's
the second point. The second point is that while he believed in cabinet government, which was a huge innovation and should be the way to run the railroad. It just isn't because of the absolute White House-centered way in which the White House is covered, which is why the Carter presidency to me is so interesting. It's one of the early, or it's a kind of superhero presidency in which he both benefited from and was massively harmed by the idea that presidents are superheroes who can just swoosh in and solve problems. When there was a nuclear reactor leak at 3 Mile Island, here the nuclear engineer who, and again, back to Jonathan Alter's book about the decision Carter made to go be in a nuclear submarine, is just beautifully rendered and tells you something about his character. But he goes to 3 Mile Island, and there he is, president on the spot, to handle this challenge. But presidents aren't superheroes, and they can't rush in to solve every challenge because the office is limited and because there are other players in the scenario. And so when you create an image of a presidency in which the president can solve all problems, you then get blamed for economic problems, many of which were out of your control. The OPEC oil embargo, the high inflation and troubling unemployment picture that he inherited when he came into the office. Like you can't just wave a wand and get those to go away, as Joe Biden learned. So he was on the losing end of that idea of the presidency. On the other hand, when it came to foreign policy and the Camp David Accords, he was massively influential. In fact, according to all of those who participated, particularly Begin and Sadat, the leaders of Israel and Egypt, he was the force that through sheer force of will and determination, the same blind sense of his own greatness that hurt him in other parts of the presidency was in fact what got that deal to go through. So those are just some of the complexities. And I would just add the final thing is, here he is, the story of America. He grows up in a tiny little town, becomes president, has this incredible sense of self, but that sense of self led to a kind of arrogance in the way he ran the White House, which goes to this idea that he could be his own chief of staff, which is crazy. And that caused real policy failures and blindnesses, which he had real trouble recognizing as a leader, that led to bad policy outcomes.
So the line on Carter as president, at least as I'm reading him reassessed today, is there this strain of moral sanctimony and moral exploration that runs through him was a problem for him as president because it made him not do political things that he could have done, and B, he was perceived as hectoring the public. Is that in fact the case, that he was not a politically effective politician because he made moral choices? And B, did the public in fact perceive him as hectoring them, or is that just a thing that people wrote about in the 80s looking back at it?
It's such a great question. It's such a great question, because part of Carter is, so how is Carter particularly in the way Republicans talk about him? He's like this. He's sort of the bogeyman of liberal kind of fuzzy-headedness. Carter, if you look at his actual policies, he was a massive deregulator. He believed in cutting the budget. In fact, he was, and the reason Ted Kennedy runs against him in 1980 is because Carter is too conservative. And he also had this sense of extreme personal moral rectitude, all of which were old-fashioned in the old version of the Republican Party, are all very consistent with that party. So my point is, your question gets right at something, which is like, there's Carter, and then there's like what Carter has become. But to the question about being censorious and kind of wagging his finger at the American public, it to me is all located in the crisis of confidence speech, which has come to be known as the malaise speech, although as everybody knows by now, the word malaise is not in the actual speech. Carter is, on the ropes in his presidency. He's planning to give another speech about the energy crisis. He had spent a great deal of time, and this is where some people say he made policy mistakes, a lot of time talking about energy in his presidency because of the oil embargo, which not only ruined people's lives because they were having to wait in long gas lines, but it led to high inflation. And it's very hard for presidents to do a lot when there is high inflation. And you're also struggling with unemployment, as Joe Biden learned. So he gives a bunch of energy speeches, and they don't really work. And he's about to give another one, and his pollster, Pat Cadell, who later becomes a kind of Fox News quasi-pro-Trump voice in American politics, says, you're just totally missing where the country is. You need to give another kind of speech. So Carter, who's on the road, or is supposed to go, I think, to Hawaii, calls the trip short, comes back, goes to Camp David, sits down in Camp David and starts receiving people, Jesse Jackson, Bill Clinton, all kinds of voices in the party, voices in America, to come tell him what he should do to help the country get sort of out of its funk. And he listens and gives a speech to the country in which he says, we basically need to suck it up. There are these external forces that are messing with our country and our lives, and we've got to return to the character that has inspired America and personal sense of duty and character and sacrifice that's always been a part of the American story. And in order to purchase people's attention in that speech, he talks about how poorly he's been doing. Remember, he comes in after Watergate and after the Vietnam War. He's going to be the president who never tells a lie. And so he engages in an extraordinary act of candor in talking about how he has not led. And he reads some quotes from people who've come to visit him at Camp David saying, you're not leading. Talk to us about blood, sweat, and tears. Stop being a manager. And he does this in order to tell people, look, I'm being hard on the American people by saying they need to kind of suck it up. Well, here I'm being hard on myself. The speech is actually quite popular when he gives it. And this goes to your question, David, which is about what was Carter and then what was the kind of story about Carter, which are two different things. It's quite popular when he gives it. But then shortly thereafter, he basically fires his entire cabinet, which again goes to this kind of misunderstanding of the presidency, even though he's trying to sort of improve it. That is what ends up looking catastrophic. And the mayhem afterwards gets kind of, in history, put on the speech. And so the idea becomes, he gave this speech and the country didn't like it. The country actually liked the speech, didn't mind the finger wagging in it. It was the firing and the chaos of his staff purge that made it look like he didn't know what he was doing. He was out of control, and he ended up doing much more harm than good with that whole episode.
I mean, I feel like unraveling that has been my favorite thing about the Carter obituaries and thinking about his legacy, because what he says in that speech to me is such a fundamental tenet of the 1970s. He says, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns. And to me, that idea is what the late 70s and the Cardigans and the Turn Down the Heat and abide by the speed limit was all about. And then Reagan and the 80s are like a materialist rebellion against all of that. And I'm a child of the 70s. And so I still feel like that sentiment really resonates. And I have grown up with the idea that the country completely rejected it. And the country did reject Jimmy Carter. So that's true. But separating the criticism, the idea, his public approval rating rose, I think, 11 points after that speech. And actually was a great relief to me to learn that. It shows, I think, that Americans can see these things in different ways at different moments, and there isn't a sort of universal rejection of these values of, anti-consumerism and selflessness.
One of the things that I find remarkable about Jimmy Carter's post-presidency, so everyone has noted correctly that he reinvented the post-presidency by creating this sense of global duty to serve, to take up causes, to bring publicity to things, to use the fame and power of his name and of the fact of having been American president to draw attention to things that haven't been celebrated. And so the idea of retirement as president has gone. Now all of our post-presidents effectively have foundations, they have activities they're performing. Trump, I suppose, was the exception. Activities they're performing for the greater public good. And that's super admirable. And he, of course, did it better than anyone and to huge effect and had a remarkable impact on the world. But there's this other aspect of it where in which he is completely out of step with what the post-presidency has become, in that he didn't spend any time palling around with rich people and riding on private jets. And that to me is almost as interesting as his do-gooding is his unwillingness to be sucked in by all these pleasures and the sycophancy and the luxuries of being a extremely famous person who can eat the crumbs of the rich and the rich are grateful to give him those crumbs. Why do you think he was so willing to forego fame and private jets, Emily?
I mean, this just seems like the ultimate proof of John's points about his character and what really mattered to him. I mean, he lived it out for 100 years, in fact, and had, as you're suggesting, like more opportunities than almost anyone in the world to leave that behind. And no one would have really been surprised or faulted him if he had done some jet setting along the way. Instead, he was like in Africa, curing the terrible problem of the guinea worm, and then also doing some diplomacy that sometimes really pissed off various presidents who were in office because he wasn't actually in sync with the politics of the moment. It's all kind of fascinating. But I guess I feel like there was this core stubbornness to Carter, and sometimes during his presidency, as you outlined, John, it was a big problem. But then once you don't have power anymore, it becomes much more commendable because you're just like doing your iconoclastic thing. And it really did seem to be a willingness to kind of stand up for these values that he grew up with.
When I interviewed him for the piece about Habitat for Humanity, I asked him about his lifelong commitment to that organization and particularly to showing up there. And there's the famous picture of him after he took a fall with a serious black eye, which I think required 14, 15 stitches. Nevertheless, going and fulfilling his commitment to build the Habitat houses. I also, when I was interviewing him, we were sort of chit-chatting, and he was talking about he and Rosalind had just finished renovating a bathroom in their small Plains, Georgia house, the one he returned to. Again, not only was he not palling around on, Richard Branson's island, but he was doing his own, at-home renovations. But he said basically that one of the things that he got out of Habitat, which he of course always described as being something that gave him something, not something he was giving other people, was he said when you were in positions of power or privilege in life, you don't have opportunities to stay in touch with people who have less than you do, and to keep them in your in your mind, and that as a Christian, since that's one of the things that you're called to do, that was what Habitat helped him do, was be because the people who are going to get the Habitat houses have to work on them. So he described it in that context. So he was basically, to your question, David, not only did he not seek out the private jets, he was actually, at least in this context, seeking out people who had the exact opposite.
Right, which I don't think I see. Look, I admire Barack Obama and George W. Bush and Bill Clinton in many ways, but you don't see those guys in any sense foregoing the pleasures of the name, the title, the fame. I don't think they're riding in economy class anywhere anytime soon or at all. And the houses are big, the luxuries are profound. Their friends are all rich people.
The amount of money raised for the libraries is insane.
Yeah, like that $861 million or whatever that the Obama library has already cost. It's just ridiculous.
You know the Carter economy class story, right? That since he did fly economy class on public planes, one of the things he would do is go through the aisles and shake the hands of the passengers on the plane, long after he was president, obviously, just as a kind of like, well, I don't know exactly what motivated him, but that he would go through and shake people's hands. And of course, all the obituaries have also his Sunday school teaching, which he kept up well, throughout his post-presidency.
Do you think we will ever have his like as a president again? It doesn't feel to me that this is a model for somebody who could get elected.
It depends if you believe in the sort of yin and yang of American presidencies and American politics. So if Carter was the answer to Watergate and Vietnam and the consistent lying of the presidents in the Nixon and Johnson, he has died when we have a president coming into office who has lied more and challenged the idea of verifiable information more than anybody in the modern era. You could imagine the cycles of American history perhaps going back to that. But one of the great questions, which maybe we can't resolve here, but is about Carter is he had, the moral rectitude of the kind people used to want and talk about all the time in the presidency. Can those values survive in the office? So Carter used to say, "I'll never lie to you." There are times presidents need to lie. It's just true. So are the kinds of values that his life is a model of antithetical to the office? Or was it just he had poorly applied those values when he was in the office? Or was it a third thing that the challenges of the office at the time were overwhelming and just, you shouldn't evaluate the relationship between personal character and presidential acumen because he was faced with a unique set of economic challenges, which he got blamed for, which, personal rectitude doesn't really come into it yet there.
I feel like it's unlikely because we don't have the same set of expectations anymore. And maybe we've moved to a different part of the Roman Empire, right? I mean, if you think we're still in the sort of healthy part of the Roman Empire where the yin and the yang applies, then sure, we could have another crisis and have another figure like Carter. But if you think we've moved on to the 200s or the 300s where everything is heading toward decadence, then it seems highly unlikely. And it seems like you need another great power to have another moment like that. Assuming human history continues, of course.
I didn't know that our Roman Empire guy was going to be Emily Bazelon. I didn't recognize that was.
It's a new year.
I am actually reading a book about the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic, I should say. But I didn't know that Emily was. How many times did you see Gladiator? How many times did you see Gladiator 2 this weekend?
Zero. Although it sounds good.
Very enjoyable.
Hi, it's Willa from Slate's Decoder Ring. I have a podcast to recommend. You've probably heard of it, but it's good to be reminded of good things that keep being good. And if not, you're in for a treat. It's Planet Money, a podcast about the economy, but in the most fun, enjoyable, least dry way you could make a podcast about the economy. It's got stories and characters and narrative and interesting ways of thinking about how money and the economy intersect with all our lives in the broadest sense. It's both for when you feel like you should understand what's happening in the economy and don't, and it's also for when you don't want to think about the news at all, but just want to be delighted with some insight into how we're living now. It tells good stories that hopefully leave you with something to chew on. So get to it. Planet Money, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Planet Money helps you understand the economy. We find the people at the center of the story.
Garbage in New York, that was like a controlled substance.
We show you how money influences everything.
Tell me what you like by telling me how you spend your money.
And we dig until we get answers.
I had a bad feeling you were going to bring that up.
Planet Money finds out. All you have to do is listen. The Planet Money Podcast from NPR.
This election cycle has already been quite a ride. Scared? Nauseous? Wishing this thing had seatbelts? Pod Save America is here to help. I'm John Lovett, and each week, me and my co-hosts, Jon Favreau, Tommy Vitor, and Dan Pfeiffer break down the political news that makes you laugh, cry, and scream into the void to help you figure out what matters and what each of us can do about it. Pod Save America, the context you need for next week's news when you won't be burdened by what has been. Listen and subscribe to Pod Save America on your favorite podcast platform now.
From Jimmy Carter to this, the reason I'm in America, along with so many critical people who built SpaceX, Tesla, and hundreds of other companies that made America strong, is because of H-1B. Take a big step back and fuck yourself in the face. I will go to war on this issue, the likes of which you cannot possibly comprehend. So this is the rhetoric we have now. This is Elon Musk, of course, posting on X as part of the fascinating fight that has unfolded between the nationalist nativist wing of Trump world and the tech bro wing of Trump world, personified by Musk. The issue, this particular issue, is the value of the H-1B program, which enables companies to bring in foreign employees for 6 years, I think, if they have skills that Americans don't have. It's used by tech companies in particular to recruit thousands of workers they claim that they would not be able to hire in America. So who are the players in this battle, Emily? How did it start?
I mean, the players in the battle are Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and other Silicon Valley folks, people who think that having the ability to hire skilled immigrants is really important for the development of American technology and our economy. And then on the other hand, you have Stephen Miller and Laura Loomer and other nativists who think that immigration is bad, kind of full stop. And, you know, mostly we talk about illegal immigration and the prospect of deportations that Trump has heralded. But this question of who comes into the country legally is also right there. And so that's an obvious point of tension between these different MAGA camps. It just seems to me like the tech bros are going to win this one. I mean, I know Trump has been all over the map in terms of what he has said about these visas, but in the end, the kinds of powerful, you know, corporate finance and tech people who he's courting care a lot about them. There is a real advantage to the United States in allowing people to come here who are highly skilled and educated or have a variety of technical skills. And the idea that, you know, you're just going to like keep them out starts to seem, I don't know. I mean, there is an argument against the visas. Bernie Sanders has been skeptical about them and argued that they can bring down wages for American-born workers in these, you know, more skilled industries. So it's not like it's just nativism and racism, but the part of MAGA world that doesn't like these visas seems highly motivated by those factors, and I just don't see how they win.
The proximate cause, I think this is right, is in this case when Sriram Krishnan, who was named by in the incoming president to work on AI policy, was Laura Loomer, who Emily mentioned, wrote on X, I think, or maybe not. Maybe it's hard to tell what's on X and what's on Steve Bannon's podcast and so forth. But anyway, Loomer, who is a, you know, extremely fringe nationalist figure who in normal circumstances, you know, by which I mean like 25 years ago, you'd be like, well, this is the kind of fringe person that attaches themselves to a president or a candidacy or something, but is just on the fringe. And like, don't focus on the fringe. But the fringe has become the rug, as Andy Card says. And Loomer palled around and was quite close to Trump during this weird part of the campaign. So this is a Trump intimate who opposed the Krishnan naming because Krishnan had said back in November that he really wanted to see skilled immigration be increased. There are about 60,000 H-1B visas, plus another 20,000 for those with master's degrees. He wants more. Tech bros want more because they help do the work, and we can talk about whether they do it at lower wages and that kind of thing. And Loomer went bonkers and went from zero to racism. I mean, I'm not actually even going to repeat the stuff she said, but like it's just straight up bilge, straight up poison. And the fact that she went from zero to that, and then Musk and Ramaswamy went from zero to what David read, and then also Ramaswamy makes this case basically about they need foreign-born high-skilled workers because Americans care more about prom queens and football players than they do actually training workers. So he went from zero to like writing off a huge segment of the American public in this debate, which is why this is about more than just H-1B visas.
So if you look back at the first Trump administration, they did do things to squeeze the H-1Bs. So even though, as you say, Emily, like on paper, H-1Bs are kind of a no-brainer if you think we want a stronger economy, we want to grow. I mean, in the immediate term, we're less interested in training our own workers and more interested in getting growth right now. If you want that, the H-1B is a kind of a no-brainer. But they did do things where they made it harder for people to apply for them. They turned them down at a much higher rate. They can tighten the definition of the occupations that are covered by H-1B visas. So they are able to do things to squeeze it, and they've done it in the past. What makes you so sure that the tech bros will win this? You just feel like, well, it's an easy win to give this excellent group of supporters who fund Trump and who bring him lots of good beneficial publicity. And why get on the wrong side of Musk when you can do so much else to restrict immigration, give them this win that they care about, and don't lose their goodwill?
Yeah, that was kind of my thinking, although maybe I'm being too cavalier. I think that in the short term, that seems all correct. And then in the medium to long term, you have Stephen Miller with a super, important job who knows how to work the bureaucracy. And so he may win out in the end. It's also kind of crazy that his wife, who I think is named Katie Miller, is now supposed to be at DOGE, the fake Department of Government Efficiency that irritates me that it's called a department since it doesn't have any governmental reality to it. Anyway, she's supposed to be over there working with Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. So we'll see how all of these things work out.
If Stephen Miller is the one who controls immigration policy in the Trump administration more than anyone, including maybe even the president, this is a spigot that has to be opened, right? As David, you pointed out, there are lots of ways in which you can tighten the definition of the kinds of jobs that are available. You could change what a prevailing wage means. Basically, if you're an H-1B visa recipient, you're supposed to be paid a prevailing wage. Some argue that the prevailing wage that is paid to these foreign-born workers is actually lower, which is why the tech bros want it, because it's basically good, smart, cheap labor. But you can tweak all that stuff in government regulations and in administration of the program, the kind of stuff Stephen Miller knows a lot about. So for the Musk and company to get what they want, Miller has to open the spigot. But his inclination and his access and his proximity to the valve on the spigot is all towards making it tighter. So it ain't so easy for this to move in a direction that Musk would want.
And then there's also this question of when is the Trump-Musk crack-up going to come? At some point, it would seem like there's going to be an episode of the soap opera in which they have some falling out, and then that shuffles this politics, perhaps.
I do think there's this interesting question beyond H-1B. When will the policy interests of the nativists, the nationalists, and the tech crypto people diverge? So I assume on China policy, for example, given how much Musk is in bed with China and how allied he is with the Chinese Communist Party and how much he's put his own production dependence on China, that there will be some sort of split moment where Musk wants looseness towards China, Musk wants looser rules towards China, Musk doesn't want all the rhetorical blow up at China, and Trump and almost everyone in Trump world does want that. So that could be a point of split. There could be a split on some things like industrial policy, the CHIPS Act, which has been almost all of the tech industry wanted the CHIPS Act, which is putting tens of billions of dollars into mostly domestic manufacture of chips and other high tech stuff. But a lot of people in Trump world thinks it's a waste of money and it's just a giveaway to big fat tech companies. So that could be another place of split. I don't know. Were there other areas, John?
Well, I guess I think those are two that are interesting, although you can argue it round or flat, as they say, because you could imagine if Trump wants a big grand bargain with China and wants to be seen as the world equivalent of Xi Jinping and a man who can, work dictator to dictator, Musk could be helpful in kind of coming up with some grand China deal. That, remember when during the first Trump administration, when Trump is willing to say nice things about China if it puts him in the position of power. So I guess my point is that what you describe as a possible splitting point is absolutely possible, but there's also another route. But as you were listing those, I was wondering, isn't one of the reasons this is interesting, at least to me anyway, is because it gets at a key question of the Trump administration, which is he was brought to the office and talks about, and so does his vice president, being the champion of regular Americans who have been, who've gotten shafted for years and years and years and years because the powerful do what the powerful and the elite want. This is a test of the powerful and the elite, and do they get what they want when there's a direct kind of conflict between what the elites want and what regular people want. You could imagine somebody coming out and saying, we don't have enough of these workers that Elon Musk wants, so we're going to do X, Y, and Z. We're going to train more American-based kids. We're going to, whatever, we're going to have more broadband. So in rural areas, that's already happening as a part of the Infrastructure Act, but in rural areas, kids can grow up to be coders for these, AI companies of the future, or whatever the story is. You could imagine a president who really cared about the Americans who've been left behind rushing into this moment and saying, hey, I know you think this might be bad for American-born workers, but here's this plate full of really interesting policy that we're going to give you to make America great for the next 40 years. That conversation didn't happen in even the most micro context. And I think that's those tensions are interesting and will be interesting to watch over the next 4 years.
It's time for another round.
May you live in interesting times.
Well, I don't think we have a choice, Mary.
Trump's back. And this time, he's got way fewer restraints and a literal playbook for MAGA-ifying the United States.
For most of human history, people have lived under kings and queens, and not everybody believes that there's anything wrong with that.
All this can be overwhelming, but you can't afford to not pay attention. That's where What Next comes in. We are a new kind of daily news podcast, fast enough to keep up and careful enough to take a step back and think.
Democracy is not a thing that we did and now have to protect and dust off. It's a thing that we still have it within ourselves to accomplish.
The next 4 years are going to be a roller coaster. You need someone there to help you figure out what next. Follow and listen to What Next wherever you get your podcasts.
Slate Money is a weekly discussion of the most important stories in the world of business and finance. Over the past 10 years, we've become known as the place to go if you want to understand what's going on in business, or if you just want to laugh at some of its successes. So if you want a podcast that doesn't turn CEOs into heroes, listen to Slate Money with me, Felix Salmon, and my co-hosts Emily Peck and Elizabeth Spires every Saturday morning, wherever you get your podcasts.
Nick Romeo, a New Yorker contributor and a lecturer at Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, has a fascinating story about a citizen assembly convened in Bend, Oregon, to try to come up with solutions to youth homelessness in that area in Deschutes County in Oregon. So the citizen assembly basically is an idea of deliberative democracy. You take a random group of citizens, a more or less random group of citizens, give them an education on an issue, and invite them to contribute ideas for solving it. It sounds like a fantasia of good government, a utopian vision of local government. It's when John Dickerson dreams of things like citizen assemblies. And I found this article that Nick did for the New Yorker fascinating. So Nick Romeo, what is the idea of the citizen assembly? Where does it come from? Why did this place end up trying it?
Thanks, David. I also find it fascinating. And, the origin of a citizens' assembly is arguably ancient Greece. People sometimes within this movement do the deep cut and talk about ancient Athens and, One innovation in particular is attributed to Cleisthenes, who was a reformer in about the 5th century, and he started paying people for serving on juries. So the idea was that if you were rich, you already could afford to, but if you were not, you needed to replace your day's wages. And so an echo of that showed up in this assembly in Oregon, where people actually were compensated for their time to get a broader section of the demographic able to participate. More recently, I would say, rather than ancient Greece, there are precedents in America, but it's more widespread in Europe. So there have been famous civic assemblies or citizens' assemblies in Paris, in Belgium, in Ireland. So there are lots of precedents around the world. I should also say that we can get into this if you like. The terminology is a little bit contentious. Some people talk about civic assemblies, others talk about citizens' assemblies. That reflects a debate that reflects some of the polarization that the process is itself trying to solve for, because citizens to some people sounds exclusive, civic sounds more welcoming. So
I really liked this idea for this reason. There's been a lot of criticism and recognition of late that when people are invited to public meetings to weigh in, like if their city council is about to vote on something or their school board, that the people who tend to show up don't necessarily reflect the whole electorate, because it's people with time and resources and money who are more plugged in, and, homeowners show up, but renters don't. And this seemed like a very deliberate corrective for that, because Bend, Oregon went out and, mailed an invitation to like 2,700 people and then made sure they had some kind of representative sample of I think a little over 100 people who were going to show up and talk. And that all seemed useful. And then I found myself becoming more skeptical of the purpose of this, in the sense that obviously these people aren't elected. And so they made a lot of recommendations about how to address homelessness and help people who don't have housing. And then it just seemed like I couldn't tell how specific their proposals were exactly. And also, they didn't seem like they had that much of a shot of actually getting enacted. And I started wondering if, in retrospect, the people who have participated, though they clearly wrestled with ideas and were doing a lot of thinking, and that part seemed great, I wondered if they were going to end up feeling frustrated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to your first point, I think that the creation of a representative cross-section of the population is a key design element. So along many dimensions, political affiliation, age, income, gender, ethnic background, there was a sort of explicit focus on recreating the demographics of the region within the room. So like you said, that meant getting a broader sort of sample of people than a typical city council meeting would have. On your second point, the sort of skeptical point, I think there were people in the room who had that exact concern. They felt like, we're spending all of this time and energy thinking very closely about a complex issue, absorbing a ton of information, listening to expert testimony on the topic, reviewing data, in some sense functioning like lawmakers, getting to know local and state jurisdictional boundaries, understanding what's possible. Will anything come of this, or is this sort of an elaborate performance? The answer to that remains unknown. There were MOUs with city council and a regional sort of governing board that operates within Deschutes County. But the terms of those MOUs basically said, we, the government entity, are going to look closely at the recommendations. We're going to try to respond to them. We're going to implement them if feasible. So, whether they become policy, I think is unclear, but they were designing the recommendations, with feasibility in mind. That was kind of part of the process. Was, obviously implausible ideas were winnowed out throughout the 5 days that these folks spent deliberating.
Two questions, Nick. The first one's just a definitional one. Is this similar to, or is there a different definitional category from deliberative democracy and what James Fishkin's been working on for years at Stanford? And then secondly, are there other hurdles if you were trying to scale this? So, for example, we've talked about some of them, executing these great ideas, having a cross-section of a community that's representative. Are there some others, like I could imagine the education process? if this really became high stakes, you could imagine people wanting to debate the shape of the table all the time. Like, do you have a sufficient number of representatives of the unhoused community or too many, and so forth and so on? What other kinds of hurdles might there be in putting this forward?
On the first question, I am hardly an expert on the deliberative democracy movement, but I think broadly folks do think of this as part of that conversation and as one of many instantiations of some of those ideas. So I would just say yes, with the caveat of my lack of expertise. On your second question, there is a whole kind of world of process design that people get very sort of involved and passionate around the details. I didn't hear debate about the shape of the table, but honestly, those are the sorts of issues that a lot of the nonprofit folks who were involved in creating this assembly and bend thought very closely about: the length of break, the seating arrangements, having microphones, voting procedures, the correct ratio of discussion to absorption of information, obviously the mix of voices in the room, whether you're kind of adequately representing key stakeholders. And then also there's a kind of appearance of neutrality that I think is important. Presumably the appearance not to the exclusion of the reality, but what I'm getting at is that, the fact that local government was not actually the convening entity felt important to the people in Bend. They wanted some remove from government so that it didn't just feel like a kind of typical civic function. Now, the long-term aspiration would be to hand the process back over to government, fold it into civic processes. But for this first instance, they sort of wanted it not to feel like the pet project of one particular elected official or another. They wanted it to feel like this sort of broad tent experiment that everyone could believe in.
Nick, in most of American political life, there is a Trump versus anti-Trump conflict that overshadows everything, pervades everything. And I know this assembly sought a balance of Republicans and Democrats, and the county itself is a pretty balanced county. I'm not sure whether it's a Trumpy county. I mean, you can have Republicans, but it not be particularly Trumpy. I wonder whether that Trump versus anti-Trump conflict manifested itself in how people met and talked, and if it didn't, why didn't it? And if it did it get diffused in some way?
Yeah, that was a sort of ongoing question, I think, for everyone throughout the 5 days, was whether some kind of enormous conflict would erupt around those issues or around sort of proxy war issues. And one thing that was very interesting was, the mere fact of being in a room with other people seemed to have some level of moderating influence on the kind of conversation people engaged in. And there are a few mechanisms that might explain that. One is just that if you spend a lot of time in the same room with people, you get to know them, what kinds of hobbies they have, where their kids went to summer camp. You sort of understand that they are more than one particular ideological point that lets you quickly categorize and dismiss them. So that might be going on. I think also it's a little harder to get into fights in a room. People do it all the time, but it's a higher barrier to entry than, say, comments online or social media. So people were sort of, I think, additionally behaving for that reason. Of course, the issues were somewhat polarizing. It's hard to talk about an issue like homelessness without, in some sense, getting into a conversation about a broadly conservative versus a broadly liberal understanding of the causes of the issue. So some folks were very much inclined to talk about individual responsibility, strong families, finding jobs. These were their initial solutions when people began discussing what causes homelessness and youth homelessness in particular. Other folks were all about the role of circumstance, the importance of structural forces, affordable housing, housing vouchers. So you saw these two streams. There's sort of a confluence of ideas. But then what was interesting was that in the assembly, both sides had to not only kind of repeat the initial talking points that they came into the conversation believing, they had to confront evidence, and then they had to confront other views. And finally, they had to propose something specific and tangible. So I think all of those elements function to further kind of moderate and make more productive the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, in line with that, it was interesting to me that it seemed as if they kind of wound up in a place with a different us versus them, where they started thinking about people who don't currently live in Bend, Oregon, and how to increase.
The problem is everyone else.
Yeah, like charge them more if they want to buy in, basically tax them at a higher rate, which it was like a way of deflecting the right-left politics into an insider-outsider politics. Thoughts?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think what you said is just right. You know, there was maybe not so much a jettisoning of us, them, as a reconfiguring of the contents of us and them. And I thought that was a fascinating moment, which is, you know, in the story where one of the delegates proposes what you might describe as a wealth tax, although I think interestingly, he doesn't frame it that way. He frames it as a sort of a tax on outside buyers of real estate. So Bend has seen lots of migration from places like San Francisco, a lot of tech money coming in. This is absolutely driving up the cost of housing. So what if some of those folks who are buying a second or a third home, what if people who are, you know, buying entire apartment buildings and Airbnb-ing them, should they pay a tax, and what sorts of services could that fund? And this came from someone who was not the kind of person you would immediately sort of affiliate or associate with higher taxes, right? I mean, he himself said, that's not how I see myself. He identified in part as a libertarian and made a comment to me like, what libertarian wants higher taxes? But something about the process sort of got him to that insight that this might be a viable solution.
Is there an identifiable, Nick, kind of special aspect to this? Is it the innate good civic juices of the individual participants that's the special element here? Or is it their actual lack of expertise, which allows the whole process to kind of go back to first principles and doesn't get lost in political jargon or expertise jargon, and that allows a community to look at problems afresh? What was there, or is there kind of a couple of aspects of this that's possible to distill what makes it, you know, so promising?
You know, I'm not sure that my sort of theory or speculation on that should have any particular weight, although I am happy to share it. A lot of people were wondering that exact thing, though. And, you know, there were researchers there from MIT, from OSU Cascades, from the Cal State system. A lot of people were kind of fascinated by this process. And everyone essentially was scratching their head and saying, well, what are the key variables? Is it something about the process, the design, the table shape again? Or is there something, you know, broader going on where people are very hungry for participation in politics, but not really given many functional avenues to express ideas, to acquire information, to sort of pragmatically articulate solutions to complex ideas? You know, so I think there's something happening. There's some kind of alchemy or magic happening, but it's very hard to identify the particular ingredients. My own sort of pet theory is that, you know, a lot of people, I heard this comment from many, many different folks. And as you mentioned, there was a huge range of people there. There were people who cleaned houses for a living, and there were people who were retired and owned second houses. And many people I spoke to, by the end of the 5 days, they wanted it to continue. In fact, one of their recommendations was, we should do this again. We should have a second civic assembly. This is great. You know, I think they felt listened to. They felt heard. They felt kind of respected. And I think these sorts of political emotions, you might call them, are absolutely vital. And when they're expressed in less functional or healthy ways, you know, we could have a different conversation about this. But this felt like a very hopeful way of channeling some of those political emotions.
Nick Romeo's piece in The New Yorker is What Could Citizens' Assemblies Do for American Politics? It's really great. It's really interesting. I think we all would happily talk about it for many, 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 many hours longer. Maybe we should have our own citizen assembly just to discuss Nick's piece. Nick, thanks for coming on the Gabfest.
Thanks so much, David.
Let's go to cocktail chatter. If you are like me having a dry January, but you still are going to have a mocktail full January, what will you chatter to me about, Emily Bazelon?
I read a book over the last couple of weeks, which I loved. It's from years ago. It's called Caucasia. I think it's the first novel by Danzy Senna, who wrote Colored Television in the last year. Another book I loved, which I think I might have recommended on the Gabfest. Anyway, just totally worth reading. Really three-dimensional characters, story about two girls, sisters, whose dad is Black and their mom is white, and their mom gets into some like radical 70s shenanigans, and the plot unfolds from there in a delightful and very moving way. So I recommend it a lot. And I also kind of 3/4 of the way recommend A Complete Unknown, which is the Dylan movie. I'm really dying to hear what John Dickerson thinks about it. It takes some liberties with actual history in a way that enriches the drama in the movie, but then also you have to kind of unravel. And the reason I only kind of 3/4 recommended is that I don't think I'm giving too much away. There's a big debate over whether Dylan can play the electric guitar at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965. And it's quite sweetly rendered from the point of view of Pete Seeger, but it's just really hard now to feel like the stakes are particularly high in this conflict. Like, really, who cares? And yet you have to kind of buy into the idea that like this is this crucial moment for folk music in which it's about to like lose all its purchase. But like we knew that already. I don't know. It was just hard for me to like enter the space where that super mattered. But I liked the movie nonetheless. John, have you seen it yet?
No, I haven't seen it yet. You know, for a certain kind of writer and person of which I unfortunately am the prototype, you have to write about this movie and you have to have an opinion about it. And since I've written about Dylan and thought about him a lot, I'm nervous about just falling right into that stereotype, but I guess I'll have to. But I'm so interested you put your finger on that, Emily, because it's such a great, how do you raise the stakes for a viewer about a fight that seems silly? I mean, there was for a long time, I don't know if they deal with this in the movie, but there was a folk tale about Pete Seeger being so enraged by Dylan going electric that he got an axe and tried to cut the cables. Now, this has sort of turned into legend and lore, and maybe kind of wasn't true, but he was certainly hot. And like, so how do you convey that to people? I'm really interested to see, and I'm so interested that you put your finger right on that, because it's not just about a movement, of course, it's also about personal artistic impulse. And Dylan, more than anybody, has changed and kept to being his own weird self, including becoming a Christian rocker for a couple of years, and sort of been like, fans be damned. On the other hand, he's been on a never-ending tour since the late 80s. And so he's like in this constant conversation with his fans. Anyway, so there you go. I've just both identified the stereotype and inhabited it.
Yeah. You have not seen the movie, and yet you chattered about the movie longer than Emily did.
Yes.
I don't know.
It sounds like a true Dylanologist.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
I wanted to give people an example of the form.
Yeah. Once you see it, you're going to have to come back and tell us more.
John Dickerson, what is your extra bonus chatter?
People are so tired of me. Mine's going to be very quick, which is that it's cocktail related, which is a friend of Anne's was having a Doc Ellis cocktail, and so named after a pitcher. And I was like, the name's familiar, but I don't remember. Anyway, I can't actually remember what's in the Doc Ellis cocktail, but that's not important. Doc Ellis claimed that on June 12th, 1970, when he was a pitcher for the Pirates, he was on acid. He was tripping when he threw his only no-hitter. He threw a no-hitter while on acid, and apparently other players of the team affirmed that he was behaving like someone on acid. And in the game, he walked 8 batters and hit 1. So he wasn't throwing only strikes, but pitched.
It wasn't a perfect game.
Yeah, but he, in fact, pitched a no-hitter while on acid, which I had never heard of. I can't believe that I didn't hear it. Anyway, the Ellis story is sad because he was a substance abuser, but has a somewhat happy ending in the sense that there are 2 Ellis cocktails. One is alcoholic and has this, that, and the other thing. But the other is a non-alcoholic drink because he got clean and devoted the rest of his life to helping people with substance abuse. So that was, the beneficial tale at the end of this. But anyway, that's a little story from baseball history.
All right. Are you feeling short of otter content, John and Emily? Do you feel that you don't have enough otter content in your life? You probably feel that way. I certainly feel that way. I've got the cure for you. Billy and Molly, an Otter Love Story. It's a documentary about a man in the Shetlands, a somewhat sad man in the Shetland Islands, this archipelago north of Scotland, who befriends or possibly is befriended by a starving young otter whom he names Molly. It's just so charming. It's kind of weird and has stunningly beautiful footage of the Shetlands, astonishing footage of otters which as a creature are just, they move in a way that it's hard to imagine. They look like they're created by AI, actually. That's what an otter looks like, some sort of error that an AI has made about how an animal will act and move. And it's just wonderful watching Molly interact with Billy and seeing the flow of the Shetland seasons pass you by. It's extremely relaxing hour and 15 minutes to spend.
Hour and 15 minutes. What a good length of time for a documentary or a movie.
Hell yeah. It was perfect. I also recommend, I'm reading a novel by Robert Harris, who wrote those kind of alternative Nazi books at Book Fatherland, but he has a historical novel based on the life of Cicero called Imperium. And I know nothing about Cicero. And it's this period right before the Republic stops being the Republic and becomes the Roman Empire. And I'm loving it. I love this book. I think it's great. It's a very detailed account of a recreation of trials that Cicero, the great lawyer of Rome, conducted and how he used those trials to advance his political career. Strongly recommend.
Writing that down.
Listeners, please send your 2025 chatters to us. Or what did you chatter about at your end of year parties? What are you going to be chattering about with people in your 2025 parties? Email them to us at gabfest@slate.com. And our listener chatter this week comes from Lawrence Coates.
Hi, Gabfest. This is Lawrence Coates from Bowling Green, Ohio. I'm chattering about the album and podcast American Railroad, a collaboration between the Silk Road Ensemble and the Grammy-winning American roots singer Rhiannon Giddens. Together, they're exploring the traditional music that has come from the working folk who built the nation's railways. The first episode explored a folk song memorializing a tunnel disaster in which a number of black workers died. The workers were convicts who had no choice about whether to work in risky conditions. The episode traced the song's evolution into a bluegrass standard that erased the original horrific event, and it ended with an authentic version sung by Rhiannon Giddens with Silk Road Ensemble. The second episode centered on the Irish who built the New York subway system. The third episode focuses on the Transcontinental Railroad. I'm really looking forward to that one. Thanks. Love the show.
That's all for our episode this week, but we also have a bonus episode in your feed. What could President Joe Biden accomplish in his last couple of weeks in the White House? What can he do? Can he do more than he has done? We're going to discuss that, but that's only for Slate Plus members. If you're a member, thank you. You get that. You get other bonus episodes. You get special discounts to live shows. You never hit the paywall on the Slate site. If you're not a member, you can get access to this episode by subscribing to Slate Plus directly from the Political Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or visiting slate.com/Gabfest Plus to get access wherever you listen. That is it for our show today. The Gabfest was produced today by Jared Downing. Shana will be back next week. Our researcher for just a couple more weeks is Julie Hugan. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Operations. Alicia Montgomery is the VP of Audio for Slate. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson, I'm David Plotz. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.